Okay, so when you talk about the moon watch, obviously you're talking about the Omega Speedmaster. The Omega Speedmaster is the watch that NASA put through all kinds of crazy tests and determined that it was the most reliable watch that they could give their astronauts to use on the lunar missions. And for years, everyone assumed that there was only one watch that had ever been used on the moon. And in part because of that, the Omega Speedmaster became this massive collectible where anybody who wanted to get a piece of space history, that was sort of like the ultimate watch that you could get. But it turns out that in 1971, during the Apollo 15 mission, a second watch was used on the moon. Astronaut David Scott used a Bulova prototype watch in place of his Omega Speedmaster. And it's just this kind of really cool, crazy story. And when I heard it, I was just it's such an intriguing story, and we'll get into more of the details of that when we take a look at the watch. But I was looking for like a chronograph watch. I was looking for a chronograph to put in my collection. And when I started making a list of chronographs that I was interested in, that were kind of in my price range, this one was a little bit above what I was typically willing to pay, but it just had such a cool history and such a cool look to it that I really put it at kind of my top of the list as probably the best chronograph that I could find for under even $500. I managed to pick it up on Amazon for $320. I got it. I've had a couple of weeks to look at it. And so now I want to take a look at today and do a review and see, is this really the best chronograph that you can find for under $500? Is it worth all this hype? Let's take a look at it and check it out and see what we can figure out. All right, first let's take a look at the dimensions of the watch. And this is actually one of the biggest complaints that people have. It is a large watch. It's a 45 millimeter diameter watch. Lug to lug is 52 millimeters. Height is 14 millimeters, but of that height, about 1 millimeter is the crystal. So just the case itself is about 13 millimeters. Then it has a standard 20 millimeter lug width. So this is a very large watch. It's something I think a lot of people are concerned that it would look too large on their wrist. For me, that hasn't been a problem at all. I have about a 7.5-inch wrist. I think it looks great and wears really comfortably on my wrist. And even the original prototype wasn't this big. I forget what the actual size on the original was. I think you can kind of get away with a larger watch on an aviation-themed watch like this. This definitely fits, I think, into the aviation category of the design. And traditionally, aviation watches were larger, so again, I think that it works here. It's also actually kind of nice because on the dial you have a lot of very intricate printing, so it helps for it being slightly larger that it's actually a little bit easier to read. And so functionally it's a very good choice, I think. That said, if you do have smaller wrists, it would probably be difficult to pull this watch off. I would say if you have anything 7-inch or larger wrist, you'd have no problem at all. Smaller than 7 inches, it might start to look a little bit too big, but again, that's largely going to be up to personal preference. And the history and heritage behind this watch is just so cool. So, as I mentioned before, it was a prototype that Bulova developed, or it's based off of a prototype that Bulova developed, and they had hoped that this would be selected by NASA to be used in the lunar missions, but it was not. It was passed over. They stuck with the Omega Speedmaster, and so Bulova was left with like 6 of these prototypes that they didn't know what to do with, so they gifted one of them to astronaut David Scott, and he actually took it with him as sort of like a backup on his mission to the moon on the Apollo 15 mission. And as fate would have it, during the mission, the NASA-issued Speedmaster that he had, it broke. The crystal popped off of it, and so he was left without a watch to use on the actual lunar EVA. And so he asked for permission from NASA to use his personal backup, and they gave him the go-ahead, and he took it with him. And so there's actually photographs of him using this Bulova watch on the moon. And that story, it was something that no one had heard about, I think, until 2015. And when it came to light, the watch was sold off at a really high price on auction. And Bulova very quickly realized they had something special on their hands, so they reissued the watch, which is this new version of it. So really cool story behind it. I think in a lot of ways almost a more interesting story than the actual moon watch and the Speedmaster has. Okay, so let's talk about the design of this watch. I think it has this really interesting kind of contrast between, on the one hand, being extremely legible due to the great contrast between the black and white color scheme, and having this like really, it seems like a really simple design. And then on the other hand, there's so many interesting little things going on that when you take a step back, There's really a lot to appreciate here. So first, talking about how legible it is. I mean, this is a watch that the printing is just incredibly crisp. You have this great contrast between the black and white. If you look at the chapter ring in particular, it's not only has, you know, what would be minute markings, but since this is for the chronograph secondhand, it uses those as second markings. It also has 1/5 of a second markings as well. So you can actually see down to 1/5 of a second just by looking at the main second hand on the dial. On the subdials, you have a 1/10 of a second subdial at 3 o'clock. You have a running second hand at 6 o'clock, and then at 9 o'clock you have a 60-minute counter for the chronograph. And for that counter, all 60 minutes are marked, so you can tell exactly down to the minute very easily on that small second subdial to tell how many minutes have elapsed. And it's just got such a clean, simple, legible design that it makes the function of the watch extremely easy to use. But it's not a boring watch by any means. There's so many interesting details going on. I mean, one thing you got to keep in mind is that this is a watch that was designed with the moon in mind. So unlike the Omega Speedmaster, which was more of a racing watch, this one has more of an aviation theme going on. You have this extremely large crown that makes it very easy to operate. The pushers for the chronograph are these kind of like long paddles or switches that I imagine would be very easy to use even if you had gloves on. The case has a nice cushion dial with a very comparatively narrow band, so it's a 45mm diameter case, but only a 20mm band, which gives it a very kind of sleek, vintage, kind of 1970s look. And then the dial itself has a lot of interesting depth and things going on. The tachometer sits on this kind of raised ring that goes around the outside of the dial, and then it falls down into kind of like a cliff that goes down into this trench where the chapter ring is housed, and that chapter ring is kind of sunk down below the dial a little bit. You take a step up to the main dial, which is a matte black, which again contrasts very nicely with the white printing as well as the white applied hour markers. Well, the subdials all are taking another step down, so they're back around the same level as the chapter ring. And on the subdials, you have a nice concentric circles texture engraved into them. The hour markers, as well as the hour and minute hands and the chronograph second hand, all have a nice cool blue lume applied to them. The lume's not particularly bright, but it does last a long time. So I think it's very functional. I think it's something that, you know, even after a few hours, you know, in the middle of the night, you'd still be able to read it in a dark room. The crystal is very interesting. They opted for a sapphire crystal instead of the original's acrylic. But like the original, the crystal protrudes a great deal above the bezel of the case. So it's a very interesting look. I've never seen a watch with a crystal that protrudes that much, and it's a flat crystal, so it's not a domed crystal. It's not because of the doming. So it just kind of pops up out of the dial or out of the case, and then you have just this flat, big sapphire crystal. And that makes me kind of nervous. It seems kind of vulnerable. It is, I guess, nice that it's sapphire, so it's pretty hard and probably going to be pretty resistant to scratches, but there's no protection around the side of that crystal. So I wonder if a knock to the side would be enough to chip it. It's a little bit nervous about that, but I will say it's a very interesting look. It's something that's kind of very unique to this watch that I haven't seen on many others, and it's something that is from an aesthetics perspective I really like. So it all comes together for a very interesting looking watch, and it's something that you don't really notice it at first because it's so clean and there's so much contrast and it's so easy to read and legible. It seems like a very simple watch, but then when you start looking at all these little details, there's so many interesting things going on that I really like it. I really appreciate all the care that Bulova put into designing this and kind of bringing it to life. It's something that's a very unique looking watch, and I haven't experienced anything else quite like it. And then to power this watch, rather than the automatic movement that was present in the original 1971 version that went to the moon, they've put in their ultra high frequency quartz movement, which I believe is the same as they use in a lot of their precisionist lines. But to me, this is actually a really interesting bonus. I mean, again, if you're going to be getting a chronograph watch, if they put an automatic chronograph movement in there, this thing's probably going to be $1,000 easy. So opting for the quartz movement really cut the cost down and put it into a range that I can get. But they didn't just put a normal quartz in. This is an extremely accurate quartz, one of the most accurate quartz movements that you can get in any watch. They rate it at up to 10 seconds a year. The other interesting thing is the running seconds hand. It doesn't tick once per second, it ticks twice per second, so you actually have a slightly smoother sweep than you would normally have on a quartz movement. And then again, having it on a subdial, so it's a smaller one, it actually seems, I think, even smoother than it actually is, but the 2 ticks per second is kind of a cool thing. So it's a really interesting movement that they've put in here, and actually functionally it makes it, you know, one of the most functional chronographs I think you can get. Because again, in a chronograph, when you're timing things, accuracy is even more important than normal when you're just trying to tell the time. And so having that packed into this watch, I think, is a really great way to, you know, save on the cost, but then also put in a really attractive, useful, interesting movement into this watch. The watch does have a few drawbacks. Some of the things that I've had noticed is one, the pushers do need to be pressed kind of hard. So they have a tactile feedback, which is great, but it is possible to press it far enough so that you feel the click, but not far enough that it actually registers. So I've had a few misclicks that way where I've tried to start and stop and it didn't actually do it. So that's a little bit annoying. Again, the crystal kind of seems vulnerable there. I haven't, you know, I'm a little bit nervous wearing it. It's a sapphire crystal, so it's pretty scratch resistant, but having it stick up like that makes me nervous that I might, you know, bang it on something and chip it. And then the straps that it comes with, I think they're very interesting straps, and they're kind of cool straps that they come with, but they're not really my favorite straps, and I tend to actually not really use either one of them that much. I think it looks much better on your standard NATO strap or on like a rally strap, and that's mostly what I've been wearing it. But with those standard 20 millimeter strap, with the standard 20 millimeter lug width, it's very easy to swap in different straps. And again, the straps that they came with are very interesting ones, so I like having them, don't necessarily like wearing them. But those drawbacks aside, for me, I can't think of a better chronograph for me personally. I mean, I love the history and the heritage behind it. I love the design. The size, I think, works fine, and just the functionality and the accuracy of that quartz, ultra high frequency quartz movement. So many cool things going on there, and you know, well worth the price, I think. Especially right now, it's dropped down to right around, sometimes you can find it for as low as $300 on Amazon or Joma Shop. So check those out. If you're interested in this watch, I would definitely recommend it. Okay, so that was the Bulova Lunar Pilot, or just the Moon Watch, if you want to just call it that. Let me know what you guys think. Is this the best chronograph under $500? Do you guys have a different one that you would recommend that you think is a better value or a better watch in that price range? Also, let me know, do you guys think that this is actually, like, is it even worth comparing to the Omega Speedmaster? I've never actually gotten my hands on a Speedmaster, so that's something I can't make that direct comparison to. All I can tell you is that I've been very pleased with the Bulova Lunar Pilot. As always, please guys, like and subscribe if this is something that was interesting to you and you want to see more videos. I'd love to keep bringing you these and keep checking out new watches, talking about watches, and yeah, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.